Listen to Danny. Thank you. A document has been circulating to everybody, the so-called Dartmouth UN bullet points. Please would people send their comments to Prachi. We're trying to get people's input and get that out for tomorrow. So please respond so that if you hate it, we want to hear. And if you like it and you want to edit it, we want to hear as well. Here we go again. Lovely. Smashing panel here. Good friends here. Twenge, oh, I said it right? Twenge is here again. And my neighbor, who's in the office next to me, Doug Staiger, who I mentioned in dispatches a few times earlier, and his good pal Tom Kane. And obviously the story here is, we've seen a couple of the comments about it, but declining test scores. What's going on? And what do you tell the president of Lesotho, as I said to Tom earlier, what do you tell the president of Lesotho or any other country or anybody who's any state in the United States? How are we going to get the test scores up? So thank you. I'm gone.
All right, so I'm Jean Twenge. I'm going to start off. I'll be 12 minutes or so, and then I will hand it over to the real experts over here on test scores and what to do about it. So just to start, as you saw my previous talk, we've got declining test scores. Here's 8th graders in the US, where we had a good news story for a very, very long time. And then around 2012, just like everything else, we started to see those declines in performance in math and reading. And in math, reading, and science, we're seeing this worldwide as well. You dial down to the region of Western Europe, and that's what it looks like. I mean, it's very concerning to see how we had progress and now we don't. And now things are going backwards, and that it's not just COVID. So the what happened question is here too. And in my view, it has the same answer as the mental health what happened question, which is that smartphones happened. So tried to dig into this recently. It's a paper that came out just a few weeks ago, so good timing, in the Journal of Adolescence. So the PISA data set, well known, it's focused on the standardized tests in countries around the world, 15 and 16-year-olds. And so in this paper, we looked at trends in academic performance, so that's the math, reading, and science, as well as school loneliness or school alienation, and how those two things were linked to two other things we were able to trace over time. One is trends in smartphone ownership. In that same data set since 2012, they have asked the teens if they have access to a phone with internet access, so that's a smartphone. And within each of those, I think it's about 35 countries or so in this analysis. And then in the most recent data collection in 2022, they asked the students, how much time do you spend during the school day using, I think they used the phrase, digital resources or electronic devices for leisure purposes? So this could be they're taking out their own phone. It could also be a personal or school laptop, and they're watching TV or playing games or shopping or doing something else. So how much time, and they estimate how much time they spend, basically off task on an electronic device during the school day. So this is all at the country level. And with the trends in smartphone ownership, as you might guess, we got countries around the world here, and there's differences in development and differences in the smartphone ownership that happened earlier in some countries versus others. So Finland, for example, smartphones came in a little earlier than in Mexico, where that happened later. So we had that data from 2012 to 2022, so that's what I'll show you. And so there's this group of countries where they're in the top 25% for the increase in smartphone ownership in that 10-year period. And then the other group had a smaller increase. Most of those countries in that smaller increase group were the ones like Finland, where they already had a very, very high level of smartphone ownership in 2012. And so it changed. It went up in that 10-year period, but not as much as those who started from that lower level. So here's science performance, for example. So in those countries where there wasn't much of a change in smartphone ownership in that 10-year period, scores on science didn't really change. Where there was a bigger change in smartphone ownership, there was a larger decline in those test scores on science. So what about that leisure use of electronic devices in school? So again, same thing, top 25%, lower 25% of those students where that number, that amount of time that they were spending in school off task for leisure purposes on those devices. There was a decrease, but not by much, and a much larger decline in these standardized test scores on science in those countries where students were spending more time during the school day on an electronic device for leisure purposes. And math performance looks very, very similar. So that, I think, really speaks to that role of devices interfering with learning. So there's another possible mechanism, which is loneliness at school or school alienation. There's a lot of research on this, not surprisingly, when kids feel like they're connected at school, when they have friends at school, when they're not feeling lonely, that is a really good thing. They're more engaged with school, they're more likely to do well in school. And there's been a big increase in school alienation or loneliness at school in this data set. So for example, here's 3 English-speaking countries. That's the trend in the US, in Canada, and in the UK. So that's the percentage who agree, I feel lonely at school. Those are pretty big increases, and they start around 2012. A few other countries here, Chile, Mexico, Hong Kong, and France, and there's some variation, but the basic pattern is very, very similar. So what does that look like in terms of more device use for leisure purposes versus less? Because recall, it's not just class time, it's when kids are using those devices for leisure purposes, then they're less likely to be talking to friends at lunch and during breaks. So that may have an impact on feeling lonely at school. So where there's more device use versus less, the more device use has a steeper increase in loneliness at school compared to those where there's less. So what are the solutions? So the no phones during the school day bell to bell is certainly catching on. So why? Well, I don't know. I went to high school in the 80s. I'm a child of the 80s. Sometimes I think about it this way, back then, would we have let people bring a TV set in to school? Of course we wouldn't have done that. And the smartphone is not only a TV set, it's not only an entertainment device, it's a communication device. It's got so much on it. It is so distracting. And in another data set, US students use their phones for an average of an hour and a half, 90 minutes during the school day and that's leisure. That's not educational purposes. So you get the bell-to-bell ban on smartphones, fewer distractions in class, so they're paying attention in class. That should, in theory, help with exam scores. I would guess in particular in subjects like math where it's difficult. You have to pay attention, you have to put that work in, and it's tough to do that if you're distracted. Plus those social elements that might help with school loneliness, that they're talking to each other at lunch. Because I hear this all the time. I hear this from students, I hear it from teachers, I hear it from principals, that in schools where kids have access to their devices at lunch, that's what everybody's doing. They're looking at their device and they're not talking to each other. You do the bell-to-bell ban, all of a sudden that lunchroom is very loud again. And a lot of students actually support this. I had a young man come up to me when I gave a talk at a private high school in Houston, Texas, and he said, I really want to talk to my friends at lunch. That's really what I want to do at that time. But I can't because they're all playing games on their phones. What can I do? And I'm thinking, I can't think of anything I can tell him to do. I mean, he could, I suppose, have a conversation with his friends about that, but I bet he already tried that. However, if his school said, okay, no phones during the school day, bell to bell, that problem would go away. Then no one would have their phone, and then they would have to, shocker, talk to each other. And maybe it wouldn't be as cringe anymore. That would be nice. I've heard varying things about this. There's some studies on this, but then there's anecdotal reports from principals saying they actually have fewer discipline issues. I mean, obviously there's a discipline issue of, hey, you have your phone out. On the other hand, there's some really terrible things that are happening in schools these days when kids have access to their phones. One is that they're taking videos of each other in the locker room and in the bathroom under the stalls, and then sending those out on a group chat or on social media. And I mean, that would be bad enough if you were an adult. Can you imagine being 12 and being embarrassed that way? And that is happening. And then there's the distraction piece, and I know this from my own kids. When my youngest was in 7th grade last year, she said, I can hear people laughing at TikTok in the bathroom. Because that's what they would do. They'd say, I gotta go to the bathroom, and then they'd take their phone, and then they would watch videos in the bathroom instead of being in class. So the other benefit is just 6.5, 7 hours a day. Learn how to live and think without that phone. That might help with some of those attention issues, might help later in the workplace of learning how to focus for that amount of time without that digital distraction. So how is this done? It really does have to be bell to bell. It's actually easier to enforce that, because if it's classroom by classroom, then some teachers are the cool teacher who lets you have your phone, and then others are the not cool teacher. She's mean and you can't have your phone in her classroom. Or, and this is my favorite, my least favorite, oh, you can have your phone when you finish your work in class. Several high school teachers in my kids' high school, that's what they do. And it's just, as a parent, I'm just like, I cannot believe that. Because of course, what is a teenager gonna do? Rush through their work so they can be on their phone. 83% of teachers in a recent poll support the bell-to-bell ban, not just the classroom by classroom. That's a big, big number. So we gotta get them physically in another location or in a locked pouch. It can be done in a number of different ways. The logistics of how to do this, of course, is gonna differ from one school to another. Yonder makes these pouches where you can unlock them. In backpacks and off, and then if it comes out, it gets confiscated. That can work if there's not resources to get the pouches or that central location. Then, though, they can still take their backpack to the bathroom, and so you got to think through exactly how to do it. I do think that we have to find many solutions. Bell-to-bell phone bans are one, but we got to get this problem solved, because that decline doesn't look like it's resolving as much as it should post-pandemic, particularly for the lower performers, and that's what my colleagues here are going to tell us about. So let me get their slides up if you give me one moment. Okay, let me turn it over to them.
Great. Thanks, Gene.
Yeah, there you go.
So I'm Tom Kane. I'm a faculty director of the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard. And there are 3 reasons why we're going to be talking about the implications for student achievement today. Number 1 is there are long-term consequences. So students learn to read and to do math while they're in school. It's very hard to pick up those skills once you've left school. And so somebody might have looked at the slides that Danny was showing earlier and say, well, is this just a phase? Maybe by the time the kids who are 15 now turn 34, 35, they're going to look just like the 34, 35-year-olds now. Maybe it's not such a big deal. But if they haven't learned to do math and literacy, that's a much bigger deal, because we have evidence that it matters for the long run. A second reason to focus on student achievement is there are 3 million teachers around the US and hundreds of thousands of school administrators who are being held accountable for student achievement. So we don't have to create the institutions to worry about this. These are existing institutions where teachers and schools are interacting with kids and with parents regularly. So if we could find a way to try to improve social media use through schools, it's much easier to do than trying to create whole new social institutions among 24, 25-year-olds. And a third reason to be focusing on the academic achievement aspects of this is it's one of the few cases where we've actually seen recently policies to try to reverse the impact of social media. And so most of the evidence that people have been citing today are a coincidence in time series. Compelling as it is, it's going to be hard to convince skeptics that it was social media that drove those trends until you turn it off and see if things go in the other way. So the cell phone bans are the first light switch moment where we get to see, do we see outcomes moving in the direction that we expect if the cell phones are causing this major decline. So with that, I just wanted to highlight a few things, and then Doug is going to talk. Many people have mentioned today that student achievement has risen was rising before 2012. What most people don't realize is just the magnitude of the change. So between 1990 and 2013, test scores increased by about 28 points on the fourth grade NAEP. So that's more than 2.5 grade equivalents. So it's almost as if we took the fourth graders in 2013 and made them look like the 6th or 7th graders from 1990. If you had told me in 1990 that that was going to happen, I would have said, you're crazy. So it's about a 60% of a standard deviation improvement over that period, so large. And then there was a decline during the pandemic. The other thing that was happening during this period was a narrowing of black-white achievement gaps. So if you've often heard K-12 education is a hopeless quagmire, we can't improve outcomes, that's completely false, actually. We were making remarkable progress up until about 2013, 2015. Now, Doug and I have some recent papers where we said, okay, well, did that matter? Was this just teaching to the test? There was a lot of test-based accountability going on during this period. Were kids just doing better at taking the test? And so we could ask, all right, how about the kids who were born in states that saw big increases on the NAEP? What happened to them later? Did their incomes go up about as much as the cross-sectional relationship between test scores and earnings would predict? And the answer is yeah. So the kids born in states like North Carolina, where I'm from, there was almost more than a 0.7, 0.8 standard deviation increase in 8th grade math achievement over this period. And the kids born in North Carolina improved in terms of their earnings later in life significantly more than kids born in other states with much smaller increases. The same was true in terms of high school graduation, college enrollment, teen motherhood went down, incarceration went down, arrests went down. So we know that testing, 8th grade math achievement and other times of academic achievement matter for longer term outcomes. Another point I wanted to make is that we know, actually Doug and I got started with this because we were really interested in what was the impact of school closures during the pandemic. And I think there's strong evidence that the school closures did play a role. It wasn't the only thing, but they did play a role, especially in widening gaps by income. So what this graph is showing is the magnitude of the decline in high poverty, low poverty, mid poverty districts by the percentage of the 2021 school year that schools were closed. And notice in the places that reopened quickly, so where they spent less of less than 10% of the 2021 school year not in person, in remote instruction, Achievement declined because remember, everybody was out in the spring of 2020. So even if you came back during the 2021 school year quickly, you still lost ground. But notice gaps did not widen. And then, but among the school districts that remained closed for longer, we saw much larger losses for the high poverty students and smaller losses for the higher income students. And we're actually seeing the results of this today. So towns like Newton, Wellesley, Lexington in the Boston area are recovering. They lost ground during the pandemic, but they're back. It's the districts like Lynn and Fall River and the higher poverty districts that are still far behind. So Horace Mann famously said that that schools are the balance wheel of the social machinery. Well, we saw that in action during the pandemic. When schools closed, we saw gaps widen. When schools reopened, schools were open more quickly. Gaps did not widen as much. All right. As has been alluded to before, one reason why I think Doug and I were late recognizing the importance of social media was before the pandemic, the losses at the mean on the NAEP were relatively minor. It was only when you looked at by percentile that it was in the 10th percentile, achievement gaps were plummeting. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this, so between 2013 and 2024, the decline in the 10th percentile was about half of a standard deviation, 0.49 standard deviations in 8th grade math. That's a huge loss. That's about half of the black-white achievement gap lost in just 9 years. In 8th grade reading, actually it was larger. It was 0.56 standard deviations lost. So it's not just that the 10th percentile is losing, it's the magnitude of the losses that should be giving us pause. Now I'm going to switch over to Doug.
Oh, thanks. That's working. Good. So why am I here? I'm Doug Staiger. I'm from the economics department at Dartmouth. And I'm here because my office was next to Tom 30 years ago, and then was next to Danny for the last 20 years. And so between that, Tom and I have been working for 30 years on things like this. And Danny, as he mentioned in his talk, I went into his office and prodded him on this after to say what is going on with mental health among the young. So what we want to do is, what I want to do with the rest of the time, or like the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, is talk about, like, okay, there was the pandemic, and that led to a lot of achievement loss for kids in the US and elsewhere. But let's think about the other factors that played a role, the kind of things that might have been happening pre-pandemic, and that this was a continuation. And everybody here has been focused on social media and stuff, but I want to just kind of break this down a little bit, because there are some other things that people in education have focused on. So the first was, you saw that big run-up. That was when there was a lot of school accountability. President Bush in the early 2000s, the No Child Left Behind Act was the first move in this. All this accountability had been very controversial, but pretty clear evidence that not just the time series, that there was, it led to real improvement in test scores. Turns out in 2015, right, they repealed the, they redid the No Child Left Behind Act, the new ESSA Act, the New Education Act, basically reduced a lot of that accountability pressure. So many people looked at the trends and said, maybe this is a US policy that led to this. A second thing that's happened is, if you've seen it probably in the papers recently, an incredible rise in absenteeism in US schools. we aren't sure whether it's been happening broadly across all countries. And then the last two, which have been the focus of this, and I want to distinguish, there's declining mental health, which by itself may be affecting test scores, student test scores. But even if they weren't affecting mental health, the attention issue, social media may be affecting test scores directly through attention in school, even if it's not doing it through the mechanism of mental health. So I want to show you some broad evidence on this, and we've got a lot more work in the hopper, and we'll hopefully have some answers on some of the questions later. So first, let's quickly think about, was this the US and ESSA? This is a busy slide, but you've already seen that the declines in test scores since 2013, 15 have happened everywhere. This isn't a US-specific issue. So this can't be a US-specific policy. It's not like all these English-speaking countries got rid of accountability. This gets a little more fine-grained. This rise in the gap between the high-scoring kids and the low-scoring that we saw in the US, the 90th percentile kind of test scores have stayed fairly flat, where the 10th percentiles have really plummeted. The US is on this graph, but you can see this has happened actually in many countries, the rise in the gap. So there's something common that can't be just driven by US policy. That rise in the gap in US policy, getting rid of accountability since it was focused on No Child Left Behind, could explain that, but not in all the other countries. Let me talk about absenteeism. This is a graph we did in a paper that it doesn't go way back in time. It could go further, but we wanted some consistent data, same schools over time. And it's the national trend in chronic absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism is missing 10% of the school year or more, so 18 days absent or more, right? 1 day every 2 weeks. Right? It had been incredibly flat for years at around 10, 15, 14, 15%. And over the pandemic, it almost doubled, right? It just took off and has stayed up. That has been a major concern in education, in the education policy world. Nobody's quite sure what's driving it. Is it about social media? Was it something, is it changing norms following the pandemic? But the one thing we know is this was not a pre-pandemic issue. So those trends that were emerging after 2013, 2015 are not about absenteeism. This is more about looking ahead. If kids aren't in school, right, this is up to 20, 25% of the kids are missing 10% or more. That's a major challenge to schools. If kids aren't in school, they're not going to learn. So looking ahead, there's a lot of concern about this. This is also something that's increasing disparities, right? The high poverty districts have seen this is the growth in chronic absenteeism rate from the low on the left to the high poverty districts in the US. So the low poverty districts saw an increase in chronic absenteeism of 8 percentage points, but the high poverty district saw nearly 20 percentage points. So it's again leading to all the things that happened in the pandemic are widening disparities and are a major concern for that issue. One thing that's really interesting, this is data from California, is you might have thought this was something about the kids who were in school at the time of the pandemic, but we've seen this even like across all grades, the rise in absenteeism. If you look, that dark solid line is absenteeism in grades 1 through 3, which used to be pretty low, under 10%, had maybe been drifting up a little bit, and it spiked up to 30%. First through third graders are 30% of them are missing 10% or more. So, this doesn't seem like it is just a pandemic. Those kids were just in first grade in the pandemic. That isn't a cell phone issue, right? There's something else going on here that I think is a big open question, but it hasn't been the broad trends, right? And probably is not related to the mental health. It's going to be related to the mental health issue probably going forward, but it wasn't what was driving the trends we've seen pre-pandemic. Here's a graph that we put together that just highlights, is there a relationship between states that had the largest increases in hopelessness, sadness of their kids in high school? You can measure that off the Youth Risky Behavior Survey. They have big samples in every state for about 30 states. And plotting that against the change in test scores for those cohorts, again from the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. You may look at this and say, oh, that's not that strong a correlation. It's a correlation about 0.5. In this correlation world and changes, that's really strong. That's very strong. And again, using Jean's thing, the states on the right that have had the largest increase, which is maybe 13% percentage point increase in people expressing hopelessness and sadness compared to people who are only, say, at 2 or 3%, that's generating about a 5-point difference on the NAEP, which is, again, a sizable amount on the NAEP score. Remember, that whole run-up was 25? 28. So a decent amount of that. So there is this relationship to mental health. Is mental health the thing causing it, right? Is that really the causal thing? Well, if it was, you might expect to see, we know social media has gone up a ton. So is that behind it, right? You've seen lots of figures like this about the rise in social media use. This is the almost constantly. It went from 24% in 14-15, now it's up to 45%, almost constantly. So you got to be using it in school. Another fact that's consistent with what we're seeing in test scores about social media is the kids who say their hours of browsing social media are greater than 7 hours per day are the kids who are scoring the least, the lowest on this is out of PISA. And there aren't many people doing no time. So compared to the 1 in 3 hours, they're scoring a lot lower on the PISA. That's not saying it's causal. That's saying the people who are browsing a lot are doing very poorly. And it's consistent with the idea that the bottom, the folks at the lowest end of the test score distribution are the ones who are really having social media problems, right? Are using a lot of social media. But the one thing that's not consistent with this idea that this is all driven, say, by mental health, the test score stuff, is here we just took out of the URBIS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, we split the sample into students who say they're getting mostly A's, mostly B's, mostly C's or lower. And just plot in there's this question over time, it's not every year, but enough years, on sadness, hopelessness. It's a question that says, in the last year, did you have 2 weeks where you felt persistently sad or hopeless? And what's really interesting is the mental health issues are happening across the spectrum of grades, of achievement, right? It's not just happening at the bottom tail thing, but we're only seeing the test scores really decline at the bottom scale, at the bottom end of the scale. So this at least makes us think that these might be one cause, but different mechanisms, right? It's not necessarily mental health. Social media is affecting mental health, and then mental health is what's driving the test scores. It's social media is having these direct effects on test scores. So this has gotten, everyone's interested in the cell phone bans now. You've seen some of this earlier. This is just the red states here, the states that, as of this year, have put in total bell-to-bell school day bans. What you might find interesting here is this is not the red-blue map. Oregon, Vermont, and New Hampshire, which are Vermont's very blue, New Hampshire's kind of more in the middle. Most of the South. So it's Massachusetts has nothing in place. So it's kind of all different kinds of states have taken different roles that don't necessarily align with political, the way you vote for president. But there are a lot of these rolling out now. And we know surprisingly little. I think Jonathan Haidt earlier highlighted this and mentioned this. We know more about the social media as social media rolled out and how it affected mental health. knowing how cell phone bans affect test scores, there's just a few studies. They're a little mixed, right? There's this study in England, but from quite a while ago, that found 0.07 standard deviations. That turns out that's a pretty big effect, at least decent, and bigger effects in the bottom quintiles, the lower percentiles of test scores. So banning cell phones seemed to help the lower end more. Sweden and Norway, some effects. The Sweden found no effect of the cell phone bans. The Norway study found bigger effects for girls. Some reduction in mental health visits, improvement in math grades, things like that. Found nothing for boys. So again, that's consistent with some of the evidence on mental health. This recent one, Figlio and Ozek in Florida, is really interesting in part. Okay, so they found some effects, good size effects of the cell phone ban on scores. The cell phone ban was not bell-to-bell. And the bell-to-bell, we think, is likely to have bigger effects. There's a real question of whether these cell phone bans that aren't bell-to-bell are really stopping use of cell phones. Are they being enforced? Found no difference in gender. And one of the really interesting things that they found was there was an increase in suspensions in the first year, right? So part of part of these cell phone bans, you have to enforce them. And so there's potentially unexpected, unanticipated negative consequences for some students of the cell phone bans. And we really don't know much about this yet, but in the next year, there are going to be 1 million studies on this to let us know. I'm going to let Tom talk about unanswered questions.
So as Doug was saying, because of all these states that have been experimenting with cell phone bans, we're going to learn a lot in the next year or so about just the impacts of the bans and which type of ban is going to have the biggest effect, whether the teacher enforced ban or the bell-to-bell ban, which type of ban has the biggest effect. I hope we're going to learn something about mechanisms as a result of this. So first, one mechanism is it's just in-class distraction. That's the thing. That's why kids aren't learning math and they're not learning literacy. It's not what's happening outside of school. It's what's happening in school. And we ought to, if that is the mechanism, we ought to learn a lot from the impact of the bans. If it's social interactions within school, so it's just the bonds and friendships that you build within school, hopefully we're going to learn a lot about that. But learning about that is going to require more than just test scores. We need some student survey data, and we're working to try to get better data. Doug alluded to the fact that one unintended side effect of the teacher-enforced bans or the bans where the phones are supposed to stay in your backpack all day but may not stay in your backpack all day is that there could be negative effects for discipline actions, especially for as the Figlio study found, for disadvantaged students. There was an increase in disciplinary actions for African American students, but not for white students in that district in Florida that they studied. So might the use of the yonder bags or the cabinets at the by the door where kids have to store their phones, do those have fewer side effects in terms of student disciplinary issues? Also, we need to be figuring out, and actually I'm not aware of policies that are intended to change the amount of out-of-school reading and cognitive challenge. I know that there are proposals for parents to take this more seriously, but ideally we could identify settings where we're going to be learning about the effect of that too outside of school. So again, interpreting magnitudes. One of the things that we saw here is the losses, particularly for the 10th percentile students in achievement, were quite large, like 0.5 or so. So far, none of the cell phone ban evidence has produced impacts that large among even among the lower achieving students. So just by learning about the magnitudes of these effects, hopefully we're going to learn something about the magnitudes of these changes. So anyway, we're hoping to generate some results over the next year that will help inform this debate. I certainly hope this is not one of these things where it's the typical academic debate where we take a decade or more to reach resolution on what the effect of the cell phone ban is. Unfortunately, right now, there's no concerted effort. There's no coordinated effort. It's all individual researchers doing their own thing, which doesn't lend itself to quick consensus formation. So hopefully we can have lots of conferences like this, Danny, in the next few years to try to reach a conclusion more quickly on just what the evidence says.
You good with slides? Can we go to questions? Can we go to questions? Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we can open it up. So, give me one sec. All right, so while I'm pulling up that file, the future research piece is so important here. And for years, I have really wanted to see someone do a study that seems pretty simple to me, which is take two high schools that are pretty similar, make sure they're similar socioeconomic status, et cetera, and do it in a state like my state of California, where there is not a uniform policy, and talk one of the principals into doing a bell-to-bell ban on phones, and then talk the other principal into maybe doing some data collection but not changing their policy, and see what happens. That hasn't been done, as far as I know, and that would be an incredible opportunity. You'd get the group level stuff, you could look at test scores, you could look at mental health, you could look at all kinds of outcomes. And if anybody wants to do that, I know the two perfect schools right in my neighborhood that are pretty well matched where you could do that.
Gene, we are doing that.
Yeah.
So it's not high schools, it's middle schools and elementary schools. So Doug and I have data on all the schools that have implemented Yonder bags in the last 4 or 5 years, and we're matching it with there's an assessment company called NWEA that many schools use tests other than their state assessment. The problem with state assessments is they're not comparable across states. But the NWEA assessment is the same assessment that I think it's something like 10,000 schools around the country are using. So we're looking at those and saying, even more than just 1 year, we're getting to see there's a whole set of schools that didn't implement any kind of ban until 24, 25. There's some that started using Yonder bags in 22, 23, we get to see what happened there. Some that started using in 23, 24, we get to see what happened there. So hopefully we'll be able to see exactly what you're talking about. It's not randomly assigned, but we can see did they have differing trends, beforehand. And we can also, because it'll be student level data, we can answer the question, were there bigger impacts for the students who were lower achieving?
Right, that's what I was going to ask, yeah, to see what levels.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm really glad you're doing that work. And then, yeah, the other piece would be to do the random assignment, same type of design.
Yeah, I think at this point it would be hard to get people to do random assignment. Maybe Doug showed the map of the light gray states that didn't have a policy yet. Maybe those places we could.
Yeah.
But we'll see. Like I think if we find big effects in the yonder bag districts, I presumably that will have a big effect on moving the debate about just, how big of an effect should we expect.
Yeah.
And let me say something about, why do we focus on these yonder bags? Other than the fact that they were willing to cooperate with us and give us data on all the schools they're in. But one of the big questions floating around here is, you have a rule at your school, but is it enforced? And the view is that the yonder bags are pretty good at enforcing. There's some other work being done by Angela Duckworth and others that we're coordinating with some where they're trying to actually survey schools to find out what really happened, right? Like in the schools that say they have this policy, what do teachers say? Do they say this really, reduced cell phone use or not? And that gets at this issue of, are we finding small effects like in that school district in Florida because it wasn't being enforced at the school level? And the one thing I feel like we've learned in a lot of work we've been doing on recovery from the pandemic is implementation is everything.
Yeah.
Right? And all these folks who say they have tutoring and are doing all this stuff to help kids recover from the pandemic, and then when you get in there and measure implementation, you find out, well, only 10% of the kids got tutoring, and most of them only got 4 hours a year, right? Like, that's not what we mean by high-impact tutoring. So I feel like cell phones, we're going to be at that point where first rule of program evaluation is be sure there's a program. And, before we start before we know whether these cell phone bans work, we have to know whether they're actually banning cell phones.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I've seen that so many schools where they say, well, we have a ban. They're not supposed to, they could only take it out for educational purposes. What does that even mean? It ends up being a free-for-all, right? So yeah, it has to be not just what the policy is, but what does it actually look like on the ground. So that's great. Let's talk about that student absenteeism, because I think that's huge, that didn't recover after the pandemic. So there could be a link to social media with that, or not just social media, but gaming, internet, just like how can those things possibly compete with, getting up at 7 a.m. and going to school? For a kid or teenager, it's hard. But there could be other causes too behind the absenteeism. What other possible causes are there? What are some of the reasons behind just there's not as many kids showing up to school on a day-to-day basis? Like what's going on?
Could just be change in family norms. But one thing I want to point out is even if the absenteeism, Doug had said this, even if the absenteeism did not drive the pre-pandemic declines, and clearly I think the evidence is pretty clear it did not, because especially at the 10th percentile, the decline had started and absenteeism did not spike until the pandemic.
Afterward, yeah.
But if absenteeism remains high, it's going to be very difficult to reverse the achievement losses.
Yeah.
So just think about the cell phone ban. Suppose cell phone bans are incredibly effective, but a lot of kids are at home using their cell phones, during the day. The cell phone bans are going to, the effect of the bans will be muted. And so whether or not they were the joint causes of the decline, the two phenomena, the increase in absenteeism and social media are intertwined now because of their role in trying to help students recover.
Jean, I want to ask you, like, so you've thought about the cell phone bans, the social media or the cell phone bans in schools a lot, and the kinds of things that are pushback on that.
Yeah.
And one that we always hear about, and I know you've thought about, is the parents say, "Oh, but what about in an emergency? I want to be able to reach my child."
Yep.
Can you talk to that and other barriers that to adopting these cell phone bans?
Yeah, so I dug into that for my most recent book because I've heard kind of surprisingly that from principals that they don't get as much pushback as you might think from students. You'd think it would be the teens themselves would be like, would hate it, and some of them do for the first week or so, especially the seniors if they've had access to that phone the other 11 years of their schooling. But for the most part, they get used to it, they're good with it. You get some pushback from parents, and most parents are supportive, is what the principals tell me, but there's a certain segment that says, I should be able to contact my child at any time, to which they say, call the front desk. And when you were 16, would you have loved it if your parents could contact you during the school day at any minute? No, many students say it's actually really stressful because their parents are texting them like, what did you get on your math test and things like that. But the one that comes up the most often is, what if there's an emergency? Particularly American parents, it's what if there's a school shooting? And that's actually one of the easier questions to answer in terms of pushback because school safety experts are virtually unanimous that it's actually safer for kids not to have access to their phones in those situations for 4 reasons. First, they're distracting and they are maybe looking at their phone rather than listening to the emergency instructions if they're trying to contact their parents or do something else. The noise from phones can alert shooters to where people are hiding. They'll tie up bandwidth. If you have 1,500 students at a big high school, all texting or doing whatever they are on their phones, then the first responders can't communicate, including the police, if they're trying to rely on cell phones as well. And then if they text their parents, which is one of these things that sounds so comforting, however, what happens then? Then, of course, the parents rush to the school, and then that creates traffic that can block access for the police and ambulances. So it's actually better if they don't have access to phones in those situations. So that argument falls apart really, really quickly. Go ahead.
Are there other, part of this I'm thinking, we face this with the decline in test scores around the pandemic. Right after the pandemic, there was a lot of money from the federal government going to schools. Some schools were getting a full year of funding additional funding from the federal government that they could use for recovery. And trying to create a sense of urgency and getting people to do things was just shockingly hard. Like the barriers there, it was costly to do the stuff, but they had the money. I think, how many school superintendents did we send and school board members? 30,000?
I think,
We sent personalized information about what happened in their district. And you just couldn't get people to do the kind of things that had to be done, right? This wasn't business as usual. Oh, we'll do a little summer school, a little more tutoring. And so I'm kind of curious. I feel like cell phones is easy in some ways.
Relatively speaking.
But if that's step one, what are the barriers we're going to face to all this, right? In schools, I know, trying to get the companies, the social media companies to not keep, what was it, human fracking? That's harder. But have you seen other barriers and ways people have overcome them?
Well, my best guess right after the pandemic for that is everybody was just exhausted. And I bet that was especially true of school administrators who had to make those decisions about when to close and when to reopen and how to get their teachers to do virtual instruction. And maybe they'd be more open to it now. But we have to think of, the phones are, I agree, just one, and then we have to think otherwise. That absenteeism piece, it doesn't look like it was originally the phones given the timing, so I have to think of other solutions.
So-
in a second, we can throw it open
Yeah,
to
but
everybody.
I've just
Yeah.
one more question for you, Jean.
Yeah.
Is that it may well be that distraction in class is not the main mechanism. That's the only thing we're going to be learning about. Well, the distraction in class and the social interaction during the school day. That's what we're about to learn about.
Right.
But maybe that's not the main mechanism. Maybe the main mechanism is students out of school time, use
Right.
of social
Distracted
media.
when they're trying to do homework.
So like,
or,
are there any policies or interventions or other than just urging parents, like are that we could be studying to try to answer that question? Because I'm afraid
Yeah.
that one possibility is a year from now we say, you know what, the places, these yonder bags, the bell-to-bell bans didn't really do anything. And the next question ought to be, okay, so what about the out-of-school use? But if there's
Yeah.
nothing going on
Yeah.
in that area, then we're not going to have an answer to that.
I would say probably the school devices, the school laptops, and the school tablets where you can watch YouTube. That would be another thing to study. Maybe the districts that have moved away from that, the schools that have moved away from that, maybe late elementary, early middle
But
school.
kids will still have their phones at home.
They will, yeah. So yeah, I don't know how big of an impact that would have. I just know how many parents are frustrated by the fact that their kids are doing stuff they're not supposed to, and they should be doing their homework on that school device that you can't put parental controls on. Yeah. Yeah. Questions, comments? Oh, someone's running to you with a microphone.
Hi. So the sharp rise that we've seen in everything bad since 2012 is really striking. It seems that, if I'm remembering right, the test scores took a little bit longer to decline, is that right? How fast do you think we could correct? How fast do you think we could correct this rise in badness of everything from 2012? Maybe not just with test scores, but with all of the other things. And like, would that trend downwards be helpful evidence, even if you don't have your...
I think people have this magical thinking about these things, right? This is like the biggest loss of human capital we've had in a long time. That doesn't come back just by waiting, right? It takes investment, right? Think of like, if we went and destroyed, every business, every manufacturing site in the US, you don't just say, oh, let's wait and in 5 years we'll be better. You need investment. And I feel like that's, there's a huge, we've been thinking about it with test scores. It was a big investment, but you could have done it, right? With enough tutoring, you could have brought even the districts, and they had the money, you could have brought them back. It's more a matter of will, right? That we're going to invest this amount of money. We're either going to have longer school years, or we're going to, it's not a magic bullet, or we're going to spend a lot of money on, $3,000 a kid on tutors. But, with that, you can come back pretty fast on the test score front. But I feel like there's an analogy to the mental health. We shouldn't think this is just going to happen. It's going to take actual investment in mental health.
And then does that...
So,
the idea that the cell phones are important. If the cell phones are the thing that we could say, now there's more understanding at this point. There was before, there was after. I'm just curious about the compounding effects of the cell phones and the social media and the antidepressants and with the rate of increase in badness, also the rate of decrease of the...
well, remember, the cell phone bans are only stopping use during the school day, so, yeah. I mean, one thing that was surprising about this study that was mentioned, the Florida study, is that the impacts only showed up in year 2. In year 1, there was no test score impacts. It was in year 2, and it was not gigantic. Now, it was a partial ban. I don't know if we're going to see that same sort of thing.
You got all these cell phone bans going into effect that you're going to study state by state, but there's
So far, there's not been dramatic cuts in Title I, the main federal program. Actually, one of the good things about congressional dysfunction is that we're operating under continuing resolution. So the dollars are still there. The dollars are there even for education research still. It's that it depends on how the department allocates them. But one thing that we are definitely sorely missing right now is any kind of consolidated, coherent effort to get answers to these questions. There is no federal, commission trying to figure out what's the impact of cell phone bans. Mm-hmm. And so it's just individual people trying to do their little studies, and it's going to be hard to come up with a consensus in time. So we're already a decade into this large loss in academic achievement. It could be another decade before there's strong consensus about the impacts of cell phone bans and social media. So that, I think, will be the greatest consequence of the federal dysfunction right now. Is that we'll just drift ahead.
Yeah, we're a minute over, so one brief question and then we will wrap up.
Back to the 36-year child and adolescent psychologist, and also same number of years in public schools and private special ed schools. I think I observed one, again, on your slides in passing, but to me that has, from my clinical experience, the greatest predictive validity of the other consequence you talked about, school phobia, absenteeism, depression, anxiety, social withdrawal, isolation. That is bullying. So if you could isolate that variable out of all the other things you're doing, and you look at the kids who've experienced that, and if they can do greater proactive work in terms of preventing it or intervening, that might help you get the solution you're looking for.
Yeah, particularly for absenteeism, I can see that having a big effect. It's a tough problem to solve. Hopefully, the bell-to-bell bans might help with that, because then at least those messages wouldn't be exchanged during the school day. It wouldn't help with after school, but it would help during. So, all right, we'll wrap up there. Thank you.